I had a chance to sit down with Glamour Magazine Woman of the Year, Vanity Fair's leader and trailblazer, and women's rights activist Gloria Feldt. She's also a teen mother turned CEO of one of the largest organizations in the country. I'm really excited for you to meet her. So your story is just an unfathomable one. You were a teen mom. How old were you when you had your first child?
I was 16 when I had my first,
16.
And I had my third when I was just a little bit more than 20 years old.
So you're less than 21 years old,
Yes.
a mother of three, and you hadn't graduated from college yet.
Right.
What was that time of your life like?
It was enormously challenging time, but I don't think I knew it yet. I just didn't really know it. I was acting out the culture of the time. I grew up in rural West Texas in the 1950s.
And what was that like? For
And
people who haven't
it was a culture in which it was not assumed at all that girls should want to either get an education beyond high school unless you hadn't gotten engaged yet and you were going to get your MRS. And nor were we encouraged to have a career.
You obviously must have had big dreams to end up where you were.
I did not have big dreams. No, I did not, because again, I was in a culture that didn't support girls having big dreams.
So even though your dad said you could be anything,
Yeah.
he was sort of an outlier.
He little did I know that he, unbeknownst to him even, that he was a feminist way back in the 1950s.
Right.
He would have never called himself that. But actually what he said was, you can do anything your pretty little head desires. So there was a little bit of,
So you've edited it a little
of
bit, yeah.
tradition in there too. Yeah. My mother was quite passive, and although she was extremely bright, and in fact she worked in my father's business, she really ran the show of the office. She was the office manager. And that, though, I rebelled against, because that was not normal in the 1950s. And all my friends' mothers stayed home. They cooked, they cleaned, they made their husbands lunch in the mornings. They were there when the kids came home in the afternoon. And my mother went to work. Well, that was not normal. So I rebelled against that. And I became a great seamstress. I made all my kids' clothes. I learned how to cook. But as I said, I soon got over that phase. The supermom phase didn't really do it for me. But I never lost my love of learning. And so after my third child was born, and after I had this wonderful new technology to pill, I decided I would start to college. And I started to the community college, and I carefully took all of my classes on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so I would only have to be away from home 2 days a week. And I finished what I could do in the community college. There was no upper division college in Odessa, Texas, where I was living at the time. And so I started doing community volunteer work. And I became involved in various groups that were furthering the civil rights movement. And one of them was the brand new Head Start program that just began. And so I volunteered for Head Start. And I then was offered a job teaching at Head Start. And that was really my first career-like job. Then after I worked at Head Start for 5 years, I then went back to school, because by then the University of Texas had opened a branch in Odessa.
So when you found out they opened a branch in Odessa, were you elated beyond?
Oh my goodness, I can hardly tell you, Sam. I mean, it's hard to even describe, but I was the first one in the door, and I finished my last 2 years in 1 calendar year.
Wow.
And I just wanted to zip through.
And so when you graduated, what was next?
Yes. Well, what I wanted to do, I thought, was I wanted to continue teaching, and I was planning to get my secondary teaching credentials and to teach in high school. I thought probably high school English, maybe social studies. Okay. I was on this path. My last semester in the summer, my last summer semester, they told me I needed an extra 3 hours of science. I looked for the easiest class I could take, and it was ecology. And I took this ecology course. And they were talking about family planning. They were talking about, that was during the era when there was much talk about how we humans would never be able to control our own reproduction. That we were going to overpopulate the world, and then we would all die. And so I thought I wanted to do a paper and learn about voluntary family planning. And I did a paper, and I went and interviewed the people at the local Planned Parenthood that had just opened just a couple of years before that. And I just got to know some of them, and this is a very strange tale that I'm about to tell you. I mean, it's a totally serendipitous thing. 2 weeks later, the executive director called me and said, I'm about to leave this job. I think you should apply.
For the executive director
Yes, for
of
the
Planned
executive
Parenthood, when you
director.
were just graduating from
I was
from
just
college
graduating from college. I was in my early 30s, so I had
Right.
a little maturity, but still, I had never managed anything. I knew nothing about healthcare
And what was your
administration.
reaction?
Well, I thought, I've never had a formal job interview. I've never had a real resume. The jobs I they had come to me.
Right.
And so it would be really great experience. They'll never hire me because I'm not qualified, so I don't have to worry. But it would be great experience. It would teach me a lot.
To go through the process.
Just to go through the process. Well, the rest, as they say, is history.
So when you look back at your own childhood, was there something that sort of, in many ways, made it so, of course, this was going to happen to you?
Well, I do think there are several things. Number one, I grew up in a town where my parents were always a little ahead of the curve in terms of their interest in social justice. But the other thing that I learned from the civil rights movement was, you know what? Women have civil rights too. And for women, if they don't have the civil and human right to control their own fertility, the rest of their rights don't really mean much.
So much of what you do is very confrontational because you're often the advocate for women's rights or for reproductive rights, and on the other end is someone who is taking pictures of women in abortion clinics or whatever it may be, even worse. But you always have this sort of smiley, non-confrontational way about you. Do you think that's part of what's made you so successful?
Well, I think that, yes, I think that is probably true. And what's behind that is that I learned you become stronger in the doing. It's not like I inherently had the strength or the courage to confront those kinds of controversies. It's that I learned by doing. What I learned was that was nothing wrong with me for having my beliefs, but there was a lot wrong with people who tried to impose their beliefs on me and on others. And I also learned, and I think this was my teaching background, I also learned that you can't beat changing opinions into people. You can only try to lead and to teach and to model. And so that's what I try to do.
When you were at Planned Parenthood in your area, how did that then suddenly one day become, I'm the CEO of Planned Parenthood?
Well, it was also an evolutionary process. I had been the CEO of first in West Texas for 4 years, and then of Planned Parenthood in Arizona for 18 years. And after the 18 years in Arizona, I was getting a little bored with what I was doing, and I thought I would leave, and that's when I was going to start writing books. So I thought I would take a couple of years off, and I would write a book. Once again, fate intervened, and I was recruited to take the national position. And it was at a moment in history where it was the right thing for me to do. It was just the right time, and I had the right skill set, knew the organization well. It was a time when the organization badly needed leadership that could take it to the next step. And so I did it, and again I thought, well, I'll do this for 2 or 3 years, fix everything, and then I'll go back and write my books. Well, 9 years later.
Happen, right? When you were at the helm of Planned Parenthood, you really saw it from 1996 to 2005, from the Clinton years to the Bush years. What was that like?
It was, the Clinton years were an era of great opportunity, much of it squandered. Even in the midst of all that, we were able to start doing what I believe was the legacy that I'm proudest of with Planned Parenthood, and that is, I think we sort of turned the mindset around from one in which we were always fighting the attacks to a proactive agenda in which we were setting the agenda. We decided, you know what, insurance plans aren't covering contraception. We're going to start passing legislation that will make sure that women can have their insurance covering their contraception, since 90% of women will use it at some point in their lives, and it's basic health care.
So that's what you did.
So that's one of the things.
That's amazing.
So that was, I love being proactive. I love building. That's what I enjoy the most.
And then when Bush took over, what was the relationship, I guess, with Washington like at that point?
It changed in a nanosecond, of course. And what we had to do was what you do when you are not in the majority, or when you're not in the majority in Congress or in the White House, and that is that you have to become the insurgent. And there's actually something good about that for a social movement, to have to think like an insurgent. That means you have to be very creative. You have to think about where are the opportunities. And more importantly, what we did was we used it as a time to educate the public. But that doesn't mean that times weren't really very, very tough during the Bush administration. And frankly, in my view, it's time to start the whole reproductive justice movement over again from the ground up as a human rights movement.
And what would that look like?
I would be organizing our legal strategies and our legislation around the principles that the ability to decide for yourself whether and when to have children is a fundamental human right, and to really get that, to talk about that. You have to first get that idea into the culture.
How big was Planned Parenthood when you were at the helm?
From a budgetary perspective, it was pretty close to $1 billion. But for me, the measure was never the size of the budget or the size of the organization. It was the people that were served, and how many people could be able to get this access to the basic health care that they needed, a pap smear, a breast exam, to be able to know that a woman could get her annual exam at a price she could afford.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's just invaluable.
So how did you acquire your business skills?
I just learned on the job. I found mentors, and I took many courses. I took many courses. Just I studied to try to learn how to do these things. And
that's always been what you fall back on, is your studying and your learning.
Yes. And one of the things I've learned in life is that if you first are doing a job and then you go try to learn how to do the job, you'll learn it a lot faster. It means more to you.
March is Women's History Month,
yes.
And you obviously have made already a large contribution to the women's rights movement. Mm-hmm. Where do you see the movement going?
Mm-hmm. I would like the movement to move more. I think a movement has to move. Power and energy come from moving into new places, not ever from standing still. And I think there's a whole wave of new younger women who are prepared to step up and to take the movement forward. Their issues won't be exactly the same ones that motivated me. And I'd like to see younger women figure out what is it that ticks you off. Because getting a little ticked off about something is often what helps you really get going.
Do you see that in women today? I mean, do you see young women and say, oh, I can see them being a future leader? I mean, in the feminist movement, or do you feel like it needs a little bit of PR or something?
Well, it needs both of those. Many young women are afraid to even use the term feminism.
Right.
And that's because people who didn't want to see feminism succeed have declared it dead so many times, and they have tried to make feminism the F word. Well, I think the F word is a really good word, and it's a great word to use. All it means is simple equality and simple justice for men and for women.
All right, well, Gloria, thank you so much for joining us today, and hopefully you are just as obsessed with Gloria Feldt as I am. Thanks for watching.